Locked with killers, what happens after the lights go out? The lights had already gone out. Inside cell block D at Attica Correctional Facility, the prison was supposed to be silent. Night lockdown had begun hours earlier. Metal doors were sealed. Guards had finished their final rounds. From the outside, everything looked controlled. But inside the darkness, men were awake. Whispers moved through the tier like wind through cracks in a wall. Coded knocks echoed from cell to cell, short, sharp, deliberate. Inmates pressed their faces to the bars, watching the hallway, waiting for the signal. Then it happened. A sudden crash shattered the silence. A metal gate slammed open somewhere down the corridor. Shouting erupted. Running footsteps pounded against concrete. Within seconds, the entire block exploded into chaos. Prisoners flooded the walkway. Some carried makeshift weapons, broom handles, sharpened metal, broken fixtures torn from the prison itself. Others simply ran, driven by adrenaline and years of bottled anger. Guards scrambled to respond, but they were outnumbered almost instantly. Keys were grabbed. Radios ripped away. One officer was pulled into the crowd before backup could reach him. Emergency alarms screamed through the facility, their high-pitched wail echoing into the night sky above Attica, New York. Searchlights flicked on outside the walls. Inside, control was collapsing. Inmates forced open additional gates, releasing hundreds more prisoners into the darkened corridors. The prison, built to contain violence, was now feeding it, block by block, tier by tier. Some prisoners shouted demands. Others shouted revenge. Fires began to burn in trash bins, filling the air with smoke. Visibility dropped. Confusion spread among staff trying to retake control of the cell blocks. By midnight, large portions of the prison were no longer under correctional officer command. Hostages had been taken. Armed inmates now stood guard over captured staff, using them as leverage as negotiations loomed. Outside the walls, state troopers, deputies, and tactical teams began surrounding the facility. Inside the yard, hundreds of prisoners gathered in the darkness, some organized, others unpredictable, all locked together in a situation spiraling beyond control. And as the night deepened, one question hung over Attica Correctional Facility. Was this a protest? Or the beginning of something far more deadly? To understand how the prison reached this breaking point, we have to rewind to the men behind the cells and the tension that had been building long before the lights ever went out. Years before the night Attica went dark, the warning signs were already there. Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York was one of the most heavily populated maximum security prisons in the United States. Built to hold the state's most dangerous offenders, it housed over 2,000 inmates in the early 1970s, many serving long sentences for violent crimes, armed robbery, and homicide. But the tension inside Attica wasn't driven by crime alone. It was driven by conditions. Most prisoners were locked in their cells 14 to 16 hours a day. Showers were limited to once a week. Medical care was slow. Mail was censored. Basic supplies like soap and toilet paper were tightly rationed. Inmates earned as little as 30 cents a day working prison jobs. Many felt they were being treated less like prisoners, and more like they had been buried alive. Racial tension made everything worse. At the time, the majority of correctional officers were white, while a large portion of the inmate population was black or Latino. Communication between staff and prisoners was often hostile, filled with distrust on both sides. Small incidents turned into violent confrontations quickly. Fights broke out in mess halls. Guards used force to maintain order. Inmates filed grievances that went unanswered. Over time, frustration turned into organization. Prisoners began holding secret meetings in the yard, whispering through cell bars at night, and passing written messages between blocks. They studied previous prison uprisings and civil rights movements happening outside the walls. Leaders began to emerge, inmates who spoke calmly but carried influence. They weren't planning chaos, at least not at first. They were planning demands. Better medical care. Fair wages. Religious freedom. An end to excessive brutality. But prison administrators dismissed most complaints, believing strict control was the only way to manage a facility like Attica. That decision would prove costly. Because by September 1971, the atmosphere inside the prison had become electric, one spark away from explosion. That spark came from something small. A fight between inmates and guards. Lockdowns followed. Privileges were revoked. Rumors spread that prisoners would face mass punishment. Fear turned into anger. Anger turned into action. And on the night the lights went out, the men who had felt silenced for years decided they would no longer stay quiet, no matter the cost. By the morning after the uprising began, Attica was no longer under full state control. Over 1,200 inmates had taken over cell block D and the surrounding yard, an area that quickly became known as Times Square. It was the center of the rebellion, crowded, loud, and dangerously unpredictable. 39 correctional officers and civilian staff were being held hostage. Some were tied up. Others were guarded closely but not harmed. Inmates knew the hostages were their only protection against an armed assault from outside. Improvised banners hung from railings. Handwritten lists of demands were drafted and redrafted as prisoner leaders tried to organize the chaos around them. Despite the violence of the takeover, many inmates pushed for negotiation rather than bloodshed. They elected spokesmen to communicate with state officials. Observers were invited in, journalists, lawyers, and civil rights activists, to witness conditions inside the prison firsthand. Among them were well-known public figures, brought in to ensure transparency and prevent an immediate tactical crackdown. For a brief moment, hope existed. Food was shared. Medical aid was given to injured hostages and inmates alike. Some prisoners even formed protective circles around the captives, understanding that if a single hostage died, the state response would be catastrophic. But outside the walls, pressure was building fast. New York State Police, sheriff's deputies, and National Guard units surrounded Attica. Tactical teams mapped the yard. Snipers took positions. Armored vehicles rolled into staging areas. Governor Nelson Rockefeller faced mounting political pressure to end the standoff quickly. Negotiations dragged on for 4 tense days. Prisoner representatives demanded amnesty from retaliation if they surrendered. State officials refused. They would discuss conditions, but not immunity for crimes committed during the riot. That refusal fractured inmate unity. Some prisoners still wanted peaceful resolution. Others believed surrender meant brutal punishment, or worse. As talks stalled, the atmosphere inside Times Square began to shift. Food supplies thinned. Sleep deprivation set in. Hostages grew weaker. Rain fell over the yard, soaking everyone in cold silence. Then, on the 4th morning, helicopters appeared overhead. They didn't come to negotiate. They came carrying tear gas. And every man inside Attica, inmate and hostage alike, realized the same terrifying truth at the exact same moment. The retaking of the prison had begun. The helicopters hovered low over Attica's yard as dawn broke through the grey September sky. For 4 days, tension had stretched to its absolute limit. Now, it snapped. Without warning, canisters of tear gas rained down into Times Square. Thick white clouds exploded across the yard, swallowing inmates and hostages alike. Visibility vanished within seconds. Men choked, coughed, and stumbled blindly through the haze, their eyes burning, lungs collapsing under the chemical fog. Then came the gunfire. State troopers and correctional tactical units stormed the prison. Shotguns and rifles blasted through the smoke. Officers fired rapidly, unable to clearly distinguish inmates from hostages in the chaos. The noise was deafening, metal, screams, boots, and gunshots all colliding in a single violent storm. Prisoners tried to surrender. Some dropped to the ground with their hands raised. Others ran for cover that didn't exist. Within minutes, the yard was retaken by force. But the cost was catastrophic. When the smoke cleared, 43 people were dead. 33 inmates. 10 hostages, correctional officers and civilian staff who had been held during negotiations. Nearly all had been killed by law enforcement gunfire during the assault, a revelation that shocked the nation when investigations later confirmed it. Dozens more were wounded. The surviving prisoners were forced to strip, crawl through mud, and endure retaliatory beatings as control was re-established. actions that would later be heavily scrutinized in court and public inquiries. The Attica uprising became one of the deadliest prison confrontations in United States history. Investigations, lawsuits, and public outrage followed for decades. Families of hostages and inmates fought for truth, accountability, and compensation. In 2000, New York State agreed to a $12 million settlement with surviving prisoners. 5 years later, a $12 million settlement was also reached with families of the slain hostages. But money never erased the trauma. For correctional officers, Attica changed prison security forever. For inmates, it exposed how desperation could turn institutions into war zones. And for the world watching outside the walls, Attica became a permanent symbol of what can happen after the lights go out, when silence, tension, and human pressure are locked together with nowhere left to escape. Because inside prison walls, darkness doesn't always mean sleep. Sometimes, it's where the breaking point begins.